That sounds a bit too scholarly, doesn't it? I just love Merton, like lots of other readers. And this afternoon, I didn't know what to call it, 6 o'clock over here. Okay, this afternoon, I wanted to focus on two parts of Merton's 1958 journal, because there's so much emphasis on the March events around Louisville, and something I find intriguing in his last journal entries from that particular year. So I have a few slides just as headlines, if I can share those. Are you seeing those? That? Yeah, okay. Let's start in 1958. Some strangers have names. So in the post-Christmas lull of 1958, Merton is wondering whether his being bound by vows to this situation is not in some way a great mistake, he writes. He's craving solitude. He's despairing that he's becoming less fit for it. It's a familiar theme to readers of the personal journals. Anyway, on 27th of December, he's feeling burdened by obligations to his superior, to the community, which he says cramp and frustrate real growth. The next day, 28th, despite a good night's sleep, he remains concerned that the genuine and deep spiritual life that he's seeking will require him, in his own words, to cut his own way through the thicket and not just follow the community. He's not sure what he wants. He seems a little embarrassed about preoccupation with his own situation, and he's no better prepared than he ever was for the solitude that he's been agitating for years. And then 2 days later, 30th of December, Merton records in his final journal entry of 1958 a kind of revelation. A revelation about why the Christmas period had been so trying. He writes this: "We were sitting in chapter in a futile discussion of a point of moral theology about absolving a dying man who is unconscious and has not expressed a desire for the sacraments, when Brother Coleman entered the chapter to indicate that Herman Hanekamp has been found dead in his house." And then Merton goes on to describe Herman as one of the very few members or former members of the community that I have ever had any desire to imitate, which is a remarkable statement. Herman had been a professed monk at Gethsemane before Merton was born. He lived with a few animals out in the woods, returning to the monastery on Sundays for communion. Merton recalls first seeing him, and he describes him as a tramp, bearded and tousled, dark as a Negro, coming up to communion with 2 Negro kids when the hosts ran out in the secular church. Merton's time-locked language about Black people, just like his gendered language, can sometimes distract us from the empathetic tone of what he's actually saying. He gives us well over 1,000 words about the particularity of this neighbour that he used to see a lot of. And then in a subsequent journal entry, Merton gives us a little more about Herman's funeral. Merton's journals are populated by very many people. And this particular affectionate portrait caught my attention when thinking about our stranger theme. There were several reasons, one of which is the way it sets in perspective that visit to Louisville earlier in the same year, which Merton later recreated for Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. The recreated version, now memorialized in brass in Thomas Merton Square in downtown Louisville, tells of Merton being suddenly overwhelmed on the 18th of March 1958 with the realization that I loved all these people, they were mine, I was theirs. We could not be alien to one another even though we were total strangers. It was Michael Mott in his 1984 biography who pointed out, before Merton's journals became publicly available, how this piece from Conjectures was constructed from those journals. Mott helpfully keeps the episode in perspective, commenting that the vision in Louisville has not worn well as writing, by contrast with other oft-quoted pieces such as the Firewatch at the end of The Sign of Jonas. And then in 1987, in the introduction to his Thomas Merton's Journey, it was Basil Pennington who described the Louisville event as of such significance that it's necessary to see all Thomas Merton wrote before and after this experience in the light of the absence or presence of it. So the episode, according to Pennington, signals a shift from a faith-based concept of solidarity to an effective conviction of the same, which brings about Merton's continual struggle against the weight of his previous formation in the Trappists. And so Louisville became pivotal to readers. I'm just not so sure that it was pivotal to Merton in the same kind of way. At least in the personal journals, the event leads in quite a different direction than it does in Conjectures, which is by the by. But what I'm wondering is whether overemphasis on a passing moment or a few paragraphs might actually eclipse or distort other detail, which is no less important or significant to Merton, who leaves us with this peculiar gift of detail and transience and ambivalence, and a great deal about the significance of particular relationships. When Merton turns a 1958 journal entry into a meditation for publication, he adds this little phrase, "even though we were total strangers. They were mine and I theirs. We could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers." So there's a shift, perhaps a transient shift in his emotional landscape, his worldview, his mood. Merton feels connected to other people, identified with them in love, which he expresses as a kind of mutual belonging. But what those people are feeling is of no consequence. The people remain total strangers despite Merton's affective conviction of solidarity. And that's as true in the original notes as it is in the published version, where the passage continues with reflections on how he had ever come to imagine himself disconnected by his special vocation. And then Merton goes on to reaffirm his solitude, his separateness, but a solitude which now belongs to others, to those strangers. Because he says, when I'm alone, they are not they, but my own self. There are no strangers. So in that passage, he says, we were total strangers, and yet there are no strangers. So he's either setting up a paradox or he's using the words in more than one way. The people are strangers in the sense that, as far as we know, Merton doesn't recognize any of them. He has no relationship with any of them. He knows nothing about their lives, which means there are strict limits to the ways in which he can identify with them at all. He feels connected, he sees a connection, but there's no relationship, as we would usually understand what that means. Their existence makes no particular demands of him, in other words. And yes, he feels connected, but even the word connection, like the stranger's word, seems to carry several meanings. For instance, I can notice and be moved by the fact that our being human means we are irreducibly linked to one another and to the earth. My seeing and feeling that might influence my behavior. It will influence my behavior, but not in the same way that the particular connections I have with, say, my sisters or my children or friends or work colleagues or any people with whom I have acted in connecting ways, with whom connectedness becomes relational and purposeful. The distinction may be not so stark if we think of Merton's publishing for strangers as a kind of acting in connecting ways, which I think it is. But there is this fascinating dynamic in his 1958 journal and elsewhere between generalized feelings expressed after Louisville and some of the particularities, such as the final entry for that year, where urgent and unsettling thoughts about monastic life surface again. Recreating the 18th of March episode, Merton strips away some of his own particularity, most obviously his heterosexual maleness. What he writes about women in the original journal is far from incidental, but it has no place in the later meditation, where his writing about love is quite differently textured. And then in his last reflection of that year, it's not Merton's own particularity which comes to the fore, but that of his neighbour. Some of the same old preoccupations and questions about his place in monastic life are interwoven with these touching recollections of Herman Hanekamp, a specific old man who was connected with and estranged from the monastic community. It's a person with whom Merton strongly identifies, and the year closes with an extended reflection on an actual relationship, a particular life. It's just one of the many moments that Merton gives us, leaving us as readers and interpreters to discover meaning through what he tells. So the parts of Merton that we highlight and the ways in which we fit together the pieces of his legacy can shape what he tells us about the ways in which we relate to one another, as strangers or otherwise. So I'm thinking about the connection between Merton's generalized expressions of love, his connection with passing strangers, and what he tells us of a particular relationship with a degree of mutuality. And then I'm thinking about the connection between my own generalized feelings about humanity and the influence of particular relationships. In Merton's case, we know little about this old man. What little we do know is because Merton writes about him. The death of Herman Hanekamp seems to shift the focus and the tone of Merton's ongoing agitation about solitude and community life, and his sometimes fraught relationships, which represent monastic structures and religious vows. And then he's brought up short by this announcement. He says, while we argue wisely about administering the sacraments to the dying, someone depending on us for material and spiritual care has died without sacraments. And Merton describes the episode as significant. The part of the journal doesn't get reworked into a new meditation as far as I can see. Some familiar themes are evident here: hermit in the woods, estranged relationships with the monastic community, religious thinking being disrupted by ordinary life, Merton's sense of connection with and love for another person, and this time a particular person. Merton highlights the tension between a monastic debate about sacraments and the lonely death of their neighbour. But as Merton tells us, Herman had chosen not to go to the monastery when he became very ill, preferring to die alone and without being a spectacle to anyone. So the relationship between monastic community and this near neighbour is complicated. And as I tried to work out what this piece of writing does to me, I think it's the particularity of Merton's connection with his neighbour, which gives the account texture and depth that I don't find in the earlier passage about strangers in Louisville. For instance, Merton is unaware of the needs and the preferences and the stories of those passing strangers because he isn't connected in the way that he's connected with Brother Herman. There's no relationship between the seer and the seen at the corner of 4th and Walnut. And when we read about Herman's death, however, I'm left wondering about my own awareness of and responses to the immediate needs or wishes of people around me. This is what the writing does to me while I'm busy doing other things, maybe praying or arguing or writing conference papers about loving one another. How does Merton's writing continue to work on us is the practical, theological, faithful question, which won't leave me alone. It depends on each reader, of course. Perhaps I do need to be awakened again to a visceral sense of human connectedness. Perhaps I need to focus on the particulars of my little life in relation to other little lives. Does a mystical sense of connection actually gain traction when it becomes grounded in particularity? Or do generalized emotions take on significance when they inform and are informed by actual instances of the thing that they generalize? The relationship between Merton and Hanekamp meant that Merton could see on the morning of Herman's funeral that the man was being misrepresented. The body laid out in the funeral parlour was that of a millionaire, he writes, a great executive. I never before saw Herman shaven in a suit and last of all in a collar and tie. Merton laments that even monks could not help but thinking of Herman as a lazy man and an escapist, because he had not taken seriously the world of business, so important to us all. For some reason, Merton goes on, he was being recast as a great rich man, tremendously respected by the whole world. Meanwhile, for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the returning coffin was hailed by the singing of skylarks and by bare woods, which stood wise and strong in the sun as if they were proud of some great success that had been achieved in secret with their connivance and consent. So Merton knew Herman well enough to see that the trees and skylarks were in more resonant relationship with him than were those monks who could not see or know as he was. Thinking a little more about this dynamic between particularity and the general, I note it was the 20th of September 1965 when Merton mentions rewriting the Louisville episode. At the time, The Way of Chuang Tzu was lined up for imminent publication. So I'm pulling a piece out of that. Merton reflects favourably on Chuang Tzu's rejection of the abstract theory of universal love. It's not the same thing as generalized love, surrounding 4th and Walnut, for instance. For a start, one is a feeling and perception and the other is a principle or an intention. But the two may end up in much the same place. If, for instance, my reading of the Louisville event flips into a kind of pursuit, if only I could fall in love with all of humanity and see them walking around shining like the sun and so on, then it's the same kind of thing as universal love. This is what Merton writes in Chuang Tzu. A system constructed on a theoretical and abstract principle of love ignores certain fundamental and mysterious realities of which we cannot be fully conscious. And the price we pay for this inattention is that our love, in fact, becomes hate. The society of universal love, planned by Mo T, was drab, joyless, grim, since all spontaneity was regarded with suspicion. Even little societies of generalized love can be grim and joyless, maybe even monastic societies. Herman Hanekamp gets only a passing mention in Conjectures, but echoes of that Christmas journal entry may be traceable at the very end of the central section where Merton closes the night spirit and the dawn air with a new firewatch meditation. And this time, by contrast with the firewatch at the end of the sign of Jonas, Merton's reflecting on the particularity of other people with whom he shares something of everyday life. The more well-known firewatch in Jonas, like the conjectures passage about Louisville, is primarily about the author's inner world. But the firewatch at the end of the night spirit, in the middle of conjectures, is more about the particular people that Merton had known as novices. They're not named, but he clearly has particular people in mind when he writes about how good it has been to have loved these people and been loved by them with such simplicity and sincerity within our ordinary limitations, without nonsense, without flattery, without sentimentality, and without getting too involved in one another's business. If we look for it, we can find Merton time and again opening up this critical dynamic between a general openness to other people, openness to the world on the one hand, and on the other, relational response to the particularity of another person. And as an example, the stranger, poverty of an anti-hero. Merton's writing on Camus' L'étranger. A decade after writing about strangers in Louisville, he's writing this essay in the spring of 1968. Merceau, Camus' protagonist, is what Merton calls the archetypal product of a social system which needs people to be as he is, and therefore manufactures them in quantity. In Merton's reading, Merceau has no role or identity except one which society has arbitrarily contrived for him and which does not fit him at all, an abstraction, a construction. And then, if you know the story, through a bizarrely indifferent, impulsive act of murder and the subsequent trial, Merceau awakens to a sense of identity. And he simply refuses the identity that's been imposed on him by society. This is Merton's reading of Camus. But he's clearly not reading Merceau's awakening as equivalent to his own religious awakening. Rather, reports Merton, Merceau simply rejects society's interpretation of him and his crime in a revolt against a total systemic explanation of existence, which falls down, not because it happens to be an inadequate explanation, but because it is total. And then Merton describes how Camus' Merceau is jolted into living without justification, and is therefore, he says, prepared to go beyond to that solidarity in revolt, and ultimately to that unity in love, which Camus intended to explore in his later work. Except it never happens. It never happens. The moment of awakening, lucidity, is not enough in Camus. A moment of mystical clarity, however it's generated, is never enough. Its meaning abides in what follows. This is Merton. One gives life a meaning by living it in openness and solidarity with others. But Merceau is utterly impoverished because he is utterly alone. He is caught in his own absurdity because, having rightly rejected the hypocrisy of systematic answers and explanations, he has not entered into solidarity with anyone else. He does not love anyone else. So he remains in his poverty. Perhaps Merton goes on working with us when we translate his words into the particularities of our own circumstances and the web of actual or potential relationships which define us. What he wrote in 1966 in another well-cited piece may be as true for us as it was for Jim Forrest. He said this: gradually, you struggle less and less for an idea and more for specific people. The range tends to narrow down, but it gets much more real. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationships that saves everything. What I've been trying to do with these brief reflections, and we're drawing to a close, is to highlight one of the distinctive ways in which I think Merton can guide our own attempts to live faithfully in these times, which is as much about how he communicates as what he communicates. Always in some way a distant stranger by virtue of his monastic alterity, he makes himself known to readers as subjective and as particular by transcribing so much personal and ephemeral detail, a vivid sense of relationship conjured from our engaging these texts can perhaps modify how we are located within the web of actual or potential relationships which define us. If Merton feared a kind of pseudo-intimacy between reader and author, the greater risk that he addresses may be that we become lost in generalities or abstractions. That risk intensifies when our generalizations about people are laced with inherited judgments and ignorance, and we get the kind of international and domestic political trends which tear us apart, not least during the past 5 years in the UK, in the US and elsewhere. So were there time, we might turn back to Merton's essay on Camus' Stranger and notice how he reads the dynamic between particular and general in relation to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth and the official racist psychosociology which was being taught at the University of Algiers when Camus studied there. More immediately, we might ask, for instance, if Black Lives Matter has been for some people an equivalent to that Louisville episode, a moment of affective awakening to a sense of connection with strangers nearby or at a distance. Then what follows? Perhaps in those moments we recognize, as Merton did, how inherited beliefs and social or religious structures have masked our own basic awareness of connection and interdependence and communion. And then he leaves me looking for ways in which seeing and feeling differently can translate into the everyday business of messy human relating, in which we pay enough attention to strangers to notice how they're being misrepresented, as he did with Herman Hanekamp, enough attention to work out what it means to be available to and influenced by the particularity of other people, whoever they happen to be. Herman Hanekamp, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Stephen Lawrence, Sasha Johnson, Emmett Till, Ahmaud Arbery, D. John Reed. I could go on, but time is up. Thank you.